Ḥayy ibn Yaqẓān, A Philosophical Tale, by Ibn Tufail, continued, Part 3. He took chips of stone and dry splinters of wood, sharp as knives, and split her open between the ribs. Cutting through the flesh, he reached the diaphragm. When he saw how tough it was, he was certain that this covering must belong to some such organ as he was searching for. If he looked beneath, he was sure to find it. Hayy tried to cut through it, but this was difficult since he had no tools, but only stones and sticks. He made fresh instruments and sharpened them. Then, cutting very carefully, he pierced the diaphragm and reached the lung. He supposed at first that this was what he was looking for and turned it round and round to see where it was impaired. What he found at first was only one lung, and when he saw that it was one to one side, while the organ he was looking for, he was convinced, must be centered in the body's girth as well as in its length, he went on exploring the mid-chest cavity until he found the heart, wrapped in an extremely tough envelope and bound by the strongest ligaments, cushioned in the lung on the side where he had entered. He said to himself, if this organ has the same structures on the other side as it does here, then it really is directly in the center, and it must be the organ I'm looking for, especially since its position is so good, and it is so beautifully formed, so sturdy and compact, and better protected than any other organ I have seen. He probed on the other side, and there too found the diaphragm and the other lung, just as before. Now he was certain this was the central organ he wanted. He tried to split or cut its protective pericardial cover, and finally, with a tremendous effort, he was able to lay the heart bare. On all sides it seemed firm and sound. He looked for any visible damage, and found none. Squeezing it in his hand, he discovered it was hollow, and thought perhaps what I actually want is inside this organ, and I have not yet reached it. He cut open the heart, and inside found two chambers, a left and a right. The right ventricle was clogged with a thick clot of blood, but the left was empty and clear. What I'm looking for, he said to himself, must live in one of these two chambers. In this one on the right, I see nothing but clotted blood, which cannot have congealed until the whole body got the way it is. For he had observed how blood thickens and clots when it flows out of the body, and this was simply ordinary blood. I see that blood is found in all the organs, but not confined to one as opposed to others. What I've been looking for all along is something uniquely related to this special position, and something I know could not live without for the batting of an eye. Blood I have often lost in quantity fighting with the animals, but it never hurt me. I never lost any of my faculties. What I'm looking for is not in this chamber, but the left one has nothing in it. I can see that it is empty. I cannot believe it serves no purpose, since I have seen that every organ exists to carry out some specific function. How could this chamber, with its commanding position, have none? I can only believe that what I was searching for was here but left, leaving the chamber empty and the body without sensation or motion, completely unable to function. Realizing that whatever had lived in the chamber had left while its house was intact, before it had been ruined, Hayy saw that it was hardly likely to return after the cutting and destruction. The body now seemed something low and worthless compared to the being he was convinced had lived in it for a time, and then departed. Hayy turned the focus of his thoughts on that being. What was it? What was its manner of existence? What had bound it to this body? Where had it gone, and how had it gotten out? What drove it away if it was forced to leave, or if it left of its own free choice? What made it so loathe the body? His mind was filled with these questions. He soon dropped the body and thought no more of it, knowing that the mother who had nursed him and showed him so much kindness could only be that being which had departed. From that, and not from this lifeless body, all those actions had issued. The whole body was simply a tool of this being, like the stick with which he fought the animals. His affection was transferred now from the body to the being that was its master and mover. All his love was directed toward that. Meanwhile, the body began to decay and give off dreadful odors, increasing his revulsion for it. He longed not to have to look at it. Not long afterwards, he noticed two ravens fighting. They fought until one struck the other dead, whereupon it scratched a hole in the earth and buried the dead one. Hayy said to himself, it surely was good of this bird to bury the other, although it was wrong to kill him. I ought to do the same for my mother. So he dug a hole, threw in his mother's body, heaped earth upon it, and went back to thinking of what controls the body. He had no idea what it was, but he observed that each individual deer had the same form and figure as his mother. In all probability, each of them was moved and governed by something like what had been given motion and direction to his mother. He was friendly to the deer, treating them more kindly for their likeness to his mother. He lived thus for a time, studying animals and plants, and roaming along the island shore in search of some being like himself, since he saw that every animal and plant had many others like it, but he found none. Seeing that the sea completely surrounded the island, Hayy believed that his island was the only land there was. A fire broke out one day by friction in a bed of reeds. When Hayy first saw it, the sight terrified him. He had never seen anything like it. For some time he stood, staring at it, gradually moving nearer and nearer, awestruck by its piercing light and the way it attacked. Overwhelmed and turned to flame everything it touched. Carried away by his amazement and by the courage, not to say audacity, God had compounded with his nature, Hayy reached out and tried to grasp a piece of it, but when he touched it, burnt his hand, and he could not hold on to it. Then he got the idea of taking a brand that was not wholly on fire. He picked it up by the end that wasn't burning, leaving the fire at the other end. This he could manage with ease, so he took it home, for he had moved into a cave, which seemed to him a fine place to live. He kept the fire up with dry grass and a good supply of firewood, tending it day and night because it seemed like such a wonderful thing. He liked it best at night, when it took the place of the sun, giving warmth and fight. It meant so much to him, he fell in love with it, and was convinced that of all the things he had, this was the best. Seeing how it always moved upward as though trying to rise, he supposed it must be one of those jewel substances he saw shining in the sky. Hayy tested the power of fire on everything by throwing things in it and watching how quickly or slowly it overwhelmed them, depending on the combustibility of the material. One thing he threw in, purely to experiment with its propensity to burn, was a fish that had been cast up on the beach by the sea. As it began to roast and the savory odor spread, his appetite was aroused. He nibbled it and liked it. In this way he learned to eat meat and practiced hunting and fishing until he became quite skilled in both. He liked fire even more now that it brought him good things to eat he had never had before. His new infatuation with fire, based on its power and all its beneficial effects, gave him the notion that what had abandoned his doe mother's heart was of the same or similar substance. This supposition was reinforced by his observation that body heat in animals was constant as long as they were alive, but that they grew cold after death. Besides, he felt quite a bit of heat in his own breast, just at the spot where he had cut into the doe. It occurred to him that if he took a live animal, cut open the heart, and inspected the same chamber he had found empty on the doe, he would find the ventricle of a living animal still occupied by whatever had lived in it, and so determine whether it was of the same substance as fire. whether it had any heat or light or not. He got hold of a beast, tied it down, and cut it open, as he had the dough, and reached the heart. This time he started on the left. Cutting into the heart, he saw the chamber filled with a steamy gas like white mist. He poked in his finger. It was so hot it nearly burnt him, and the animal died instantly. This satisfied him that the hot vapor was what imparted animation to the animal, and that every animal has something corresponding. When this departs, the animal dies. A desire was aroused in him to study all the other animal organs, their organization, placement, number, and interdependence. How the heat of that steam reaches them, giving life to them all. How it lasts as long as it does, where it comes from, and why its heat does not dissipate. He followed this up by dissecting and vivisecting many animals, constantly learning and improving the quality of his mind, until he had reached the level of the finest natural scientists. By this time, it was plain to him that each animal, although many in respect of its parts, its various senses and types of motion, was nonetheless one in terms of that spirit which stems from a single fixed place and diffuses from there to all the organs. All parts of the body are simply its servants or agents. The spirit employed the body much as he himself employed the tools with which he fought, hunted, or dissected. His weapons could be classified as offensive and defensive. His hunting gear could be divided into those implements appropriate to land animals and those for fish. Similarly, his dissecting tools could be classified as those suitable for cutting, breaking, or boring. The same body handled all these tools, using each appropriately for its own purpose. In the same way, the one vital spirit uses the eye as a tool for seeing, the ear for hearing, the nose for smelling, the tongue for tasting, the skin and flesh for feeling, the limbs for moving, the liver for feeding and digestion. Each one of these organs is at the service of the spirit, and would be deprived of its functions were it not directed by the spirit through what we call the nerves. For when nerve pathways are cut or blocked, the functions lapse in the organ to which they lead. These nerves do no more than transmit the animal spirit emanating from the brain, which in turn derives it from the heart. The brain has in it a great many spirits, since it is highly compartmentalized. If for some reason any organ does not receive this spirit, like a useless discarded tool, it can work no longer. And should the vital spirit leave the body altogether, or in one way or another disintegrate, or become extinct, the whole body is stilled and dies. This type of thinking had brought him to this point when he had completed 3 sets of 7. That is, when he was 21. By this time he had grown quite ingenious. He dressed in skins from his dissected animals. From these he also made shoes. He got thread from animal hair, hemp, and the pith of reeds and cattail stalks and other fibrous plants. The original idea of making thread came from his initial use of the tall grass. He made awls of tough thorns or splinters of reed sharpened on a stone. By watching swallows, he got the idea of building himself a storehouse for surplus food, secured by a door of cane sticks tied together against the intrusion of animals while he was away. He trained some birds of prey to help with his hunting and kept poultry from which he got eggs and chicken. He made some semblance of spear points from the horns of wild cows and mounted them on sturdy lengths of cane or beechwood shafts. After hardening in fire and sharpening with chips of rock, they were as good as real spears. He also made a shield out of several plies of hide. This was due to his realization that despite his lack of natural weapons, he could manufacture everything he wanted to make up the lack. Seeing that no animal would stand and fight with him, but all ran away and wore him out with running, he tried to think of some ingenious method of catching them, and came to the conclusion that the plan most likely to succeed was to gain the confidence of one of the swifter beasts, and feed it so well so as to be able to ride it in pursuit of other animals. There were some wild horses on the island as well as wild asses. Hayy found some that were suitable and trained them as he had planned. Then out of thongs and rawhide he contrived saddles and bridles. So, as he had hoped, he was able to chase animals he had found difficult to catch. He accomplished all these things during the time when he was still engrossed with dissection, and his one great passion was to understand the differentiation and the characteristic functions of all animal organs. And this is within the period I have sketched, ending with his 21st year. At this point, he took up another task.